The officer was dressed for work when they answered the door. It was 6:44 in the morning. The people on the other side were not colleagues. What the FBI had spent 48 hours building, financial records, access logs, a wire transfer from a Montenegrin bank account, had started with something much smaller. One analyst, one memo, 3 incidents that should never have clustered the way they did, and 4 years of patience from a foreign intelligence operation that had been waiting for exactly this moment. The analyst's job was straightforward: track Iranian military behavior in the Gulf region, map it against a classified framework that described how the U.S. military assessed its own response thresholds, note when something didn't fit. She had been doing it long enough to know what normal looked like. Normal looked like probing, a foreign military force testing boundaries, pushing in one area, pulling back, pushing somewhere else, mapping the edges of what would trigger a response. That was standard operational behavior, expected, documented across decades of Gulf region activity. What she was looking at was not that. 3 separate incidents over 4 months. Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps forces, the IRGC, conducting operations near American and coalition assets in the Gulf. Drone activity, vessel interference, direct harassment of naval units. Each incident different in method. Each incident separated by weeks, but all 3 landing inside the same analytical band. Not near it, not approaching it, inside it, precisely, as if someone had measured the distance to the line and stopped exactly 1 step short of it every single time. That band existed in one place. A classified Pentagon assessment document that described in specific terms where American decision-makers would shift from a measured diplomatic response to something more serious. Fewer than 20 people had direct access to that document. The IRGC was not on that list. She wrote it down, flagged it as a counterintelligence concern rather than an analytical observation, routed it through the Pentagon's counterintelligence liaison. The note reached the FBI at 9:14 on a Wednesday morning. 48 hours later, the policy committee that maintained those classified threshold documents was scheduled to meet, to update them, to produce a new analytical picture of exactly where American red lines sat. If the source feeding Iran that information still had access when the update was distributed, the clock was already running. To understand what had been compromised, it helps to understand what deterrence actually looks like at the classified level. The public version is simple. America maintains military forces in the Gulf. Those forces signal capability. The signal discourages aggression. That is the version that gets discussed in press briefings and policy papers. The classified version is more specific. Inside the Pentagon, analysts maintained a detailed framework that went far beyond general capability signaling. It described, in precise analytical terms, the specific conditions under which American decision-makers would authorize responses of increasing severity. Not a single tripwire, not one red line. A layered map, scenario by scenario, category by category. What level of IRGC activity would produce a diplomatic response? What level would produce a measured military response? What level would cross into territory where a significant response was not just likely, but required? That map existed because military planning requires specificity. Commanders need to know not just that a response is possible, but what kind of response, under what conditions, authorized by whom, constrained by what political and diplomatic factors. It was classified because the operational implications of its exposure were severe. If the IRGC had access to that map, the real map, not the public ambiguity about American red lines, but the specific analytical picture of where those lines actually sat, they could do something that no amount of operational experience could otherwise produce. They could plan to stay inside the safe zone. Each individual provocation would fall short of triggering serious action. No single incident would cross the threshold that required a decisive response. But the cumulative effect would be real. Coalition deterrence credibility eroding. IRGC's operational freedom expanding. The gradual normalization of Iranian military activity in contested spaces, achieved without ever crossing the line that made a serious response unavoidable. That was the theory. The three-incident cluster suggested it wasn't a theory anymore. The IRGC had not been probing for the threshold the way foreign military forces normally probe, pushing across a range of activity to find the edge. They had been operating inside a specific band, with a precision that probing alone could not explain, which meant the question was no longer what Iran knew, it was who told them. 31 names were on the distribution list. The investigation was about to get much smaller. The distribution list for the current cycle's classified threshold assessments contained 31 names: senior officials, policy officers, intelligence analysts, personnel across multiple agencies whose documented roles gave them authorized access to the framework that described American deterrence thresholds in the Gulf region. 31 names, 48 hours, one policy committee meeting at the end of it that would update every document on that list. The investigation did not start with all 31. The analytical specificity of what the IRGC had demonstrated narrowed the field immediately. Whoever had provided the threshold information had provided it in enough detail that the IRGC could identify the relevant operational band precisely, not a general sense of American risk tolerance, a specific analytical category with defined parameters. That level of detail argued for direct access to the underlying documents, not summaries, not derivative products, not second-hand briefings. Of the 31 names, 14 were officials at agencies whose processes for receiving and consuming the assessments would have produced summary-level access rather than the full analytical picture. That left 17. Financial forensics and behavioral analysis opened on all 17 simultaneously at 11 a.m., less than 2 hours after the referral reached the FBI's counterintelligence division. The behavioral analysis returned its first significant finding within 11 hours. It was not what the investigation team had expected. The 31-name distribution list, the formal, documented, access-controlled list that the investigation had used as its starting point, was not the full picture. The threshold assessment documents were updated every 6 months, but between those formal updates, the Iran Policy Office maintained something else entirely: a working document, continuously updated, tracking IRGC activity against the threshold framework in real time, noting when incidents approached thresholds, when the analytical assessment of a specific threshold had shifted, what the current operative picture looked like at any given moment. The working document was not on the formal distribution list. It was more current than anything on that list. And if the IRGC's operational precision reflected access to a real-time picture rather than a 6-month-old assessment, the investigation had been looking at the wrong document. The access log for the working document had just been pulled. What it contained would change the shape of everything. The working document had existed for 18 months. It was maintained by the Iran Policy Office's senior staff, updated continuously as IRGC's activity developed. Designed to give policy officers a current picture of where the threshold framework stood, not where it had stood 6 months ago when the last formal assessment was completed, but where it stood today. The formal assessments described the framework. The working document described its current state. That distinction mattered for one specific reason. The IRGC's 3-incident cluster had not just landed inside the correct analytical band, it had landed inside the correct band at the correct moment, reflecting not just knowledge of the framework's structure, but knowledge of its current operative parameters. Thresholds shifted. IRGC activity in the weeks before each incident could have moved the analytical picture in either direction, raising a threshold in response to de-escalation, lowering one in response to prior provocation. The working document tracked those shifts in real time. The formal assessment, 6 months old, did not. If the IRGC's precision reflected current knowledge rather than historical knowledge, the working document was the source, not the formal assessments on the 31-name distribution list. The access log for the working document was obtained from the Iran Policy Office's classified system within 2 hours of the behavioral analysis flag. The log covered the full 18 months the document had been maintained. 47 access events, recorded with timestamps, credential identifiers, and session durations. The investigation team reviewed all 47. 44 of them were unremarkable, distributed across 8 regular users. Access patterns consistent with documented roles, analytical staff, and senior policy officers accessing the document in connection with specific events, scheduled meetings, assessment cycles, normal, expected, accounted for. 3 were not. 3 access events. The rest of the log made sense. Those 3 did not. The 3 anomalous access events shared 4 characteristics. Each one occurred in the evening, between 7 p.m. and 9:30 p.m., outside standard office hours, outside any documented scheduled work activity for the relevant credentials. Each one lasted between 22 and 35 minutes, longer than the baseline review duration for users with comparable familiarity with the document, long enough to read the document carefully, long enough to record its contents. Each one was made using the credentials of a single senior policy officer in the Iran Policy Office, an officer whose documented role included oversight of the threshold framework's analytical maintenance and whose clearance provided full authorized access to the working document. And each one occurred between 3 and 7 days before one of the 3 IRGC incidents that had established the operational band clustering pattern. 3 access events, 3 incidents, 3 to 7 day windows between them. The pattern did not require interpretation. It stated its own conclusion. The IRGS was not acting on intelligence that was months old. They were acting on intelligence that was current, updated within days of each operational decision. Someone was accessing the working document, capturing its current analytical picture, and getting that picture to Iranian handlers fast enough to inform active operational planning. The senior policy officer's daytime access events across the 18-month period were consistent with their documented function, routine, scheduled, tied to specific operational requirements the office's activity records could account for. The 3 evening events were tied to nothing. No scheduled work activity, no authorized remote access request, logged with the office's security coordinator. No operational requirement documented anywhere in the Iran Policy Office's activity records for those dates. 3 sessions. No documentation. No explanation. And on the other side of each session, within 3 to 7 days, an IRGS operation calibrated with a precision that the working document's current analytical picture would have made possible. The behavioral identification was clean, cleaner than most. The kind of pattern that did not require statistical modeling or probabilistic assessment to interpret. But behavioral correlation alone was not enough. The investigation needed to answer a question that the access log could not answer on its own. Why? A senior policy officer with authorized access to classified threshold documents, a legitimate role in the Iran Policy Office, and a career built on U.S. national security work. What turns that person into a source for Iranian intelligence? The financial forensics team had been running for 23 hours. At hour 23, they found the real estate transaction. 25 hours remained. The financial trail was about to produce something that had been hidden for 4 years. Financial forensics in counterintelligence investigations follow a standard progression. Current accounts first. Salary patterns, spending behavior, visible assets. Looking for the obvious anomalies. Sudden wealth, unexplained transfers, lifestyle inconsistencies that don't match documented income. The officer's current accounts were clean at the surface level. No obvious anomalies. Nothing that would have flagged in a standard financial review. The investigation went deeper. A 10-year look back. Full transaction history. Every account, every asset, every documented financial event across a decade. At year 6 of the look back, 4 years before the investigation opened, a real estate transaction appeared. A condominium. Northern Virginia. Close proximity to the officer's Pentagon workplace. Purchase price of $420,000. The financing was standard on its face. A mortgage covering 70% of the purchase price. A down payment of $126,000 documented in the closing records. The down payment had originated from a wire transfer. The wire transfer's source account was at a financial institution in Montenegro. That detail alone was enough to redirect the entire investigation. A $126,000 wire transfer from a Montenegrin commercial account as a real estate down payment, in a counterintelligence context, in a case already flagged for potential foreign intelligence involvement, was not a detail that required speculation to interpret. It required tracing. The Montenegrin account's ownership was traced through the financial institution's regulatory records. Two intermediary corporate layers, both resolved to a financial holding entity registered in Dubai. The Dubai entity's beneficial ownership was traced further. It connected to an infrastructure node that NSA Foreign Financial Intelligence had documented in 3 prior counterintelligence investigations. Each one had involved IRGC external operations payment channels, the same financial infrastructure, the same routing pattern, the same endpoint, a payment mechanism that Iranian intelligence had used in at least 3 previous cases to compensate sources inside the U.S. government. $126,000. Montenegro, Dubai, IRGC, applied as a real estate down payment 4 years before the investigation opened. 2 years before the officers' assignment to the Iran Policy Office gave them access to the working document that had been feeding Iranian operational planning. The IRGC had not recruited someone with access. They had recruited someone without it, paid them, secured the relationship with a significant financial transaction, and then waited. 2 years. Until the operational assignment materialized, and the intelligence product they had invested in became available. The patience of that approach was the most significant detail in the entire financial record. This was not opportunistic. It was not reactive. It was a long-term investment in a specific intelligence outcome. And it had been paying returns for at least 2 years before anyone noticed the pattern. The recruitment was already 4 years old. The access had existed for 2, which meant every threshold assessment produced in that window was potentially compromised. Every one. 17 hours remained before the policy committee meeting. The meeting that would update every classified threshold assessment in the Gulf region deterrence framework. The meeting whose output, if distributed through standard channels before the officer's arrest, would land in the officer's credentials within hours of its completion. The updated assessments would reflect the American government's internal reckoning with the 3-incident pattern. The policy community's analysis of what the IRGC's operational precision had revealed about the existing framework's exposure. The adjustments made in direct response to what the investigation had identified. That reckoning, in IRGC's hands within 3 to 7 days of the update's distribution, would be more damaging than the original breach. Not just current threshold intelligence that included the U.S. government's own assessment of how its previous thresholds had been exploited. The arrest needed to happen before the meeting. That was clear. But the timing created a problem that the arrest alone could not solve. If the IRGCs concluded, through whatever means they had of monitoring their source's status, that the policy committee meeting had been the proximate trigger for the arrest, they would draw the correct inference. That the threshold assessment update had been identified as the exposure point. That the new assessment, whatever it concluded, had been produced with full knowledge that the previous intelligence picture had been compromised. A foreign intelligence operation that knows its source has been burned does not simply lose one intelligence stream. It recalibrates its entire operational picture. It knows the specific parameters of what it no longer knows. It can infer, from the timing and nature of the arrest, something about what the investigation found and when. That inference, applied to Gulf region operational planning, could produce a more unpredictable threat environment than the one the investigation was designed to close. The arrest had to precede the meeting, but it could not appear connected to it. The solution required modifying the meeting itself. The policy committee's formal assessment update was pulled 2 days forward, moved to the morning of the arrest, before the officer would be taken into custody, under a classified emergency authorization that restricted attendance to personnel whose credentials had not been flagged in the behavioral analysis. The external schedule remained unchanged. To any outside observer, including any surveillance of U.S. policy activity that Iranian intelligence maintained, the meeting appeared to be proceeding on its original timeline. The modified meeting would produce an updated assessment that the officer had never received, distributed through a restructured channel that had been rebuilt to exclude the officer's credentials entirely. The warrant application was filed at 2:33 a.m., built on 4 evidentiary pillars: the real estate transaction and its IRGC financial infrastructure connection, the 3 evening access events, and their correlation with the IRGC incident timeline, the officer's post-recruitment assignment trajectory establishing the 4-year preparation window, and the government-issued tablet's local session history, examined at the evidence facility, showing 3 remote access sessions that matched the working documents log to within network latency margins. Authorization was granted at 6:11 a.m., 1 hour and 49 minutes before the modified policy committee convened. The meeting was set for 8 a.m. The arrest team was already moving. If anything went wrong in the next 93 minutes, the updated assessments would reach the wrong hands before the day was over. The modified policy committee convened at 8 a.m. under classified emergency authorization. Attendance was restricted to personnel whose credentials had not appeared in the behavioral analysis. The absent officer's credentials had been removed from the distribution channel the night before. No one in the room was told why the officer was not present. The meeting proceeded. The updated threshold assessments were produced, distributed through the restructured channel. The IRGs did not receive them. At 6:44 a.m., 76 minutes before the meeting began, the arrest team made contact at the officer's residence. The officer was dressed for work. A personal laptop, a mobile phone, and a government-issued tablet were secured at the scene. All 3 were transported to the evidence facility immediately. The government-issued tablet was examined first. Its local session history contained 3 entries that the investigation team had been building toward for 44 hours. 3 evening sessions. Remote access to the classified system from outside the office environment. Timestamps matching the working documents access log to within the network latency margin. The small gap in seconds that accounts for data travel time between a remote device and a government server. The tablet had not been wiped. The session history had not been cleared. Either the officer had believed the evening access events were invisible within the broader log, routine credentials used that would not surface against 44 other entries, or they had made a calculation that the risk of clearing the history was greater than the risk of leaving it. That calculation had been wrong by 44 hours and 1 analyst's memo. The personal laptop and mobile phone went to digital forensics. Their contents are part of the classified evidentiary record. What they contained beyond what the warrant had already established has not been disclosed in any public proceeding. The policy committee met at 8 a.m. Updated assessments produced, distributed, contained. The officer was in federal custody. The working document's current analytical picture, the one the investigation had protected, had not moved. The IRGC's intelligence feed had gone dark at 6:44 a.m. without explanation. They didn't know why it had stopped. They would have to operate without knowing. That was the point. Consider a different version of the same 48 hours. The analyst writes the same memo, notes the same pattern, flags the same implication, that the IRGC's operational precision suggests knowledge rather than probing. But the memo is treated as an analytical observation. Interesting, concerning, worth monitoring, routed to an analytical team for further review, rather than to the counterintelligence liaison as a referral requiring immediate investigation. The 48-hour window closes. The policy committee meets on its original schedule. The updated threshold assessments are produced and distributed through the standard channel. The officer's credentials receive the update. Within 3 to 7 days, the window the access log had established. The current analytical picture of American deterrence thresholds in the Gulf region is in Iranian hands. Not just the updated thresholds. The updated thresholds as shaped by the policy community's internal reckoning with the 3-incident pattern. The American government's own analysis of how the IRGC's operational behavior had revealed limitations in the previous framework. The IRGC receives a document that tells them two things simultaneously: what the new thresholds are, and what the previous thresholds had shown about American analytical thinking when they were being exploited. A fourth incident follows, calibrated to the new analytical picture, inside the new operational band, below the new threshold for decisive response. Then a fifth, then a sixth. The officer continues their role. The next working document update, whenever the analytical picture shifts enough to warrant one, produces the next access event. The next IRGC incident cluster follows in the 3 to 7 day window. The cycle does not end. It upgrades. Each iteration more precisely calibrated than the last. Each one informed not just by current threshold intelligence, but by the accumulated analytical product of an intelligence relationship that has been running, undetected, for years. Coalition deterrence credibility in the Gulf region erodes in a way that is visible to every regional actor. American red lines, already ambiguous in public, become effectively meaningless in practice. IRGC operational freedom in contested maritime spaces expands without triggering the responses that would constrain it. None of it requires a single incident that crosses the threshold for serious response. All of it is achieved by staying precisely inside the safe zone. The analyst's memo prevented that version of events from materializing, not because she had access to the financial records, not because she knew about the working document or the evening access events or the Montenegrin wire transfer, because she noticed that 3 incidents in 4 months had all landed in the same analytical band, and she wrote it down. The cycle was broken. The source was gone. But the question the investigation had not answered, could not answer, was whether the IRGC had been running one source or two. The legal proceedings that followed the arrest navigated a specific tension that espionage cases involving classified intelligence create inside the federal criminal justice system. The working document, the specific content that had been transmitted, the precise threshold band that the access events had captured, could not be introduced into any public proceeding without creating the operational exposure the investigation had been built to prevent. Describing in open court what had been stolen would effectively complete the theft. The prosecution was built on what could be shown without that exposure: the real estate transaction and its connection to IRGC's financial infrastructure, the access event correlation with the IRGC's incident timeline, the government-issued tablet's session history, and its match to the working document's access log, the 4-year recruitment timeline established by the financial records, the classified evidentiary supplement covering the working document's content and the specific threshold band correlation, was handled in closed session under SIPA procedures. The Classified Information Procedures Act exists precisely for this situation, allowing classified evidence to inform a prosecution without entering the public record. The officer has not cooperated. 5 words that close a significant number of questions and open one larger one. An uncooperative defendant in an espionage case does not just decline to confirm the prosecution's theory. They decline to answer the questions the prosecution cannot fully answer on its own: how the information was transmitted, who the handlers were, whether the access events captured in the working document's log were the complete record of what had been passed, or whether the transmission methods that left no log entry, no session history, no traceable credential event. The financial record established a payment. It did not establish a complete picture of what that payment had purchased across 4 years and 2 access cycles. The Iran Policy Office's working document now operates under a dual-officer credential system. Every access event logged not just by timestamp and credential identifier, but by session content. What sections were reviewed, at what level of detail, for what documented operational purpose. The IRGC's intelligence picture of the American deterrence framework is frozen at the previous cycle's conclusions. The updated assessments, produced the morning of the arrest, distributed through the restructured channel, are not in their possession. The 4th incident did not occur. The military assessment of whether the IRGC used threshold intelligence beyond the 3 documented incidents Whether the operational advantage extended to planning that has not yet produced a visible event is classified in its findings. That assessment has not been declassified. What is known is this: the analyst noticed the pattern. The referral reached the right desk. The 48-hour window closed in time. What is not known is whether the window was the only one that needed closing. The officer has not cooperated. And somewhere in the gap between what the access log recorded and what 4 years of an intelligence relationship actually produced, that question remains open.